DJ Leroy.
Night Watchman. It seems like forever since we've been together. What's going on?
Yes, but here we are once again.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I want to give a little shout out to Miss Marlene Archer, who transitioned on Sunday, May 22nd. She will truly be missed in her village of Central Harlem. And shout outs. This show is dedicated to you and others who, let's say, suffer pain, right? Night Watchman. So, as they say, let's get it popping. What we got going on tonight?
Well, I wanted to just chime in on that too. I actually was going to say that before you said it, but it's important because we usually start off with a little bit of banter. But let's face it, both of us are processing this profound loss. Your sister, who you've known your entire life, and right. I've known actually the majority of mine at this point in time.
Wow, you're right.
Yeah,
you're right.
So I'm an activist, somebody who is smart, passionate, cared about people, always ahead of her time in terms of just thinking, and always profoundly committed toward people. And so we love her, we miss her, and we will carry on in her energy.
Absolutely.
And,
Night Watchman, thank you for that. Beautiful. All right.
Yeah.
So what's popping tonight, man?
Well, tonight we're talking about one of our continuing topics, which is cannabis and the development of the cannabis industry here in New York City and New York State. We are pleased to have returning to the show Saki Fenderson, the CEO of Tainted Love BK, and somebody who has been a cannapreneur, an activist, and just a general joy to have back on the show. Saki, what's going on?
Hello, and I am going to try to keep my 4-letter words down tonight.
Okay, all right, okay.
I have to say that out loud so I remember to do it.
Well, at least now that we have a form of legal cannabis in New York, we have less reason to use them.
Yes.
Well, no, we don't, but it's a happy thought. It's a hopeful thought.
All right. Well, we're cautiously optimistic and still working hard to make sure that this thing turns into the industry that we want to have. Yes. And returning,
that we need to have. Can I please add that?
We need to have. Absolutely. And returning to us, of course, Dr. Stephen Robinson, the president of the Society of Cannabis Clinicians, our resident expert on medical cannabis and cannabis health. Welcome back, Dr. Stephen.
Greetings and thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And I'm sorry for your loss. It is a time of individual loss as well as collective loss. We certainly need to draw on all of our access to higher powers to help us get through this into a time of healing.
Very true. Very true. And, well, as we say, Night Watchman, let's get it popping.
All right. So, Saki, we haven't talked to you in a while. So, first, you could just kind of give us a little overview of your journey into the cannabis industry, and then tell us a little bit about your thoughts about where you are and where you feel the industry is now.
So, I think the last time we spoke, my colleague Mary Pryor and I were on with you, and we were talking really about how we can get the MRTA passed, what we can do to turn the Marijuana Regulation Taxation Act in New York into law. And that happened, as we all know, March 31st. It was signed into law of 2021. So now we're at the point, after a huge amount of delays from former Governor Cuomo, our current Governor Hochul, she actually finally got the ball moving so that we could get the industry moving. So as advocates, one of our huge victories were that the criminal justice reforms were put into play immediately. So basically, as of April 1st, you could carry up to 3 ounces of cannabis. You could smoke it in any place that was legal to smoke cigarettes. And the expungement process started for people who had low-level cannabis offenses. And that's basically what is legal now. If you had an offense for it prior to March 31st, 2021, that's now expunged, right? So that was tremendous, but the industry hadn't moved yet. So we were at the point where you could possess and smoke a certain amount of cannabis, but where was that coming from? So it's like immaculate conception. You could have weed, but you couldn't buy weed. So that's kind of where we're at now. We're at this point where we got weed, but we can't buy weed. And so we're in what a lot of people call a gray market area. And that's a bit of a limbo where people who are still selling cannabis are committing a felonious act. And there is no expungement for this. Anything after the law has passed, there is no expungement for you. So, we're now at the point where we are setting regulations so that people can legally sell the plant.
Gotcha. And doctor, have you also seen this lack of movement or commitment to actually, solving this issue of, well, we certainly know equity, but really making the market in New York State fair?
Well, let me just say that, before actually relocating back to New York, I spent a number of years in California evaluating patients for the use of medicinal cannabis. And that is where the Society of Cannabis Clinicians got started, since California was the first state to legalize the medicinal use of cannabis through the activity of a number of patients, HIV/AIDS sufferers, cancer patients. A lot of citizenry activism got the medical ball rolling. And this seems to be the nose under the tent in terms of, it seems, how states come to cannabis first through a medical door, and then realize that all of the horrible stories they've been told over the past 70 or 80 years, reefer madness, used to more addictive drugs like heroin as a gateway, as they realized that this was in fact not true, then they began to look at legalizing adult use. And of course, it doesn't help to have a lot of the promises of immense tax revenue sort of encouraging states to move in that direction. I must say, though, that in terms of New York State, in addition to the criminal justice provisions, there are also, I think, it's gone a long way in terms of looking at how other states have implemented their legalization to avoid some of the major mistakes, and to put in place, I'd like to say, in addition to the criminal justice prevention, which should end this whole egregious practice of like stop and frisk. They put in place provisions in terms of child protective services, so that if mothers are in the maternity ward and test positive for cannabis use, that in and of itself is not an automatic trigger for the intervention of child protective services. And this should, minimize the tremendous family disruption that has occurred. Also, another aspect of the war on drugs, or war on drug users. So I think New York is to be applauded for learning from some of the mistakes of other states, but there's still a long way to go.
Okay. Well, okay. So Saki, in terms of your collaboration with Mary Pryor, right? What were some of the, let's say, impediments that you saw in terms of real expansion or inclusion in that space? And some of the things that still might exist.
So that's a really multifaceted level, because one of the things that Dr. Robinson mentioned is this tax revenue. Right now, cannabis is a cash cow, and it's a highly regulated cash cow with a lot of with still a lot of stigma, right? And so that's where we have this access issue in terms of inclusivity, right? Because the people who can afford to financially regulate, to financially maneuver in all these regulations, don't come from our communities, right? And then on the next level is where a lot of our leadership and community members are extremely happy about the criminal justice reforms and these discussions about how cannabis has been used to put us in prison and stunt our ability to move in economic platforms, right? They still don't want to deal with the plant. And everyone, I'm helping my mother today, and she has made an incredible recovery, and she's just rolled herself with her assistant into the room. So please excuse
No problem.
and now she's starting to dance. So that's part of our stigmas. And that means that people don't want to be in the industry. We also don't approach it on different levels. So we can approach it on a community level, right? And on a community level, meaning that we as a community mobilize to make sure we have access within our community and not within governmental regulations. And that means we setting up economic systems within our community, like landlords coming together, people who own their property and saying, look, we want to create a safe space for our community in this industry. So we're setting aside these properties and these things for cannabis. People who are contractors, people who are HVAC, people who are accountants, people who are lawyers, basically us setting up our own economic structure within inside of it, right? Working within our community, like the numbers game, right? The people who ran the numbers were part of our community. They provided jobs, they provided opportunities. Cannabis did the same thing, and we should protect it in the same way, right? So then that's one level. Then there's the corporate level. Then there's the level where we are inside of those executive suites, where we're inside of those places making decisions about the plant on a higher level, right? And then there's the governmental level, ensuring that we have access to resources because those resources were taken from us with the plant in the first place.
And Saki, I guess one of the other things I wanted to say, okay, I remember, I think it might have been at an HBA summit. And I know she was talking about some of the, let's say, pushbacks that we also experience in our own community. And one of the big ones, of course, was hello.
Oh, hello.
And certainly one of the big pushbacks, Saki, was the let's say the Black church or spiritual leaders.
And our faith-based community is another area that we have to target, because they also know the suffering that our community took under the war on drugs. And so for them, a lot of it meant chastity, abstinence. It meant if we just stay away from it, then we won't suffer from the repercussions of it. Do you want to be back on camera, Mom? Is that what
Yeah, I think someone had said that the most harmful thing about using cannabis was the getting caught using cannabis. And unfortunately, I think the war on drugs didn't. It may have started, but drugs have been used to disrupt the Black community. Along with the war on cannabis, there's there's heroin, there's crack, there's all these things come in from outside the community. And it's been a community under siege for decades. And it was actually a political strategy that was, really quite clearly articulated by Nixon and his henchmen in terms of cannabis in particular, because he really wanted to go after radicals and hippies and Blacks, but couldn't come out and pass legislation that prohibited, that attacked those communities directly, but realized that both groups use cannabis, and that was one way to pursue them. So, the clergy is in a very, a conflicted position, because they want to keep their constituents and their community safe, and without the ability to change those larger forces that are bringing drugs into the community. The one thing they can do is say, to prohibit use, to keep people away from it, to keep them safe, which is unfortunate, because it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And if you look at the history of the plant use through millennia, it is before this country and colonialism existed. The plant was being used medicinally in ancient Egypt and ancient China, and written in the medical textbooks, thousands of years old. And the process of unwinding that prohibition and that stigma, I think, begins with that education. And there's
do you think that the advances in medical cannabis are helping that unwinding? I know certainly that there's been a lot of publicity around CBD for pain management, and I feel like there's more of an adoption of CBD as something that can be used by an older population, that population that might be in the church, that people are more open to it when they have talked to somebody who's tried it and have gotten good results. So do you think that is helping the conversation with the clergy?
I think it has the potential to do that. There's a whole consideration of CBD as the good cannabinoid, because it has less psychoactivity than THC, which is the one that the intoxicating variety. Even though we realize medicinally that THC has a definite place. But there are other certainly examples of how CBD has helped children with intractable seizure disorders. In the tremendous media attention to that aspect, and that's one approach. But we realize that holistically the plant is certainly much more than CBD, and CBD does have a particular role to play, but
Can I interject?
Sure.
I do want to. So, my organization, TLBK, one of the things we say is it's a medicine first, and we say this because a lot of what happens is there's this separation between the plant as a medicine and the plant as a recreational drug. right? So you'll see that a lot of places categorize it as recreational or adult use, and then the other category is medical, right? Now, on the really real, part of that is taxation. We definitely don't want to tax our patients high, right?
Right.
And so how do we get that tax money? We call it adult use or recreational. But the other part is the way we think about the plant, right? We think that the plant is two different things. It's one plant. Everything about the plant, first and foremost, it's a medicine. And we say often, even if you don't feel high, it's still working. It's still doing what our body needs.
Nice.
And this is, of course, ironic that I say, because I'm deathly allergic to the plant. I can't breathe it. I can't smoke it. I can't be around it growing, blooming, flowering. I can't wear hemp clothing. I can't do anything with the plant. I cannot eat CBD, which I think is hilarious because people are like, it's CBD. I'm not allergic to THC. I'm allergic to the plant. But the point of this is that it's a plant like strawberries, like oregano. It is something that we use. Some people think about it like a food, even like the minerals and nutrients that we get as a food. These are things that our body needs. And because of prohibition, we're at a point where we're at a deficiency in our society. It's not in our groundwater. It's not in our soil. It's not in our ecology. And because it's not in our ecology, we're functioning as a deficit. And this is part of the explanation people have for some of our neuropathies, some of our autoimmune issues. Shoot, I remembered the 4-letter word.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Shoot, it's one of the reasons that we're even having so many anxiety issues, you know? And so this is part of our medicine. And when we start separating it, that also is part of the issue, you know.
And Saki, for folks who may not know, TLBK stands for?
We used to be known as Tainted Love BK. And, you know, we actually started making edibles for people around the time that New York City put that ban of smoking in parks and public places. And remember, a lot of us needed to go to the park to smoke. We couldn't smoke in our buildings. We couldn't smoke in our buildings. We couldn't smoke on the corner because the police would get us. So we had to go to the park and walk and smoke. And so now this created a whole other level of exposure for us to law enforcement. So we thought we'll make it safer. We'll make these edibles and people could eat those. And, you know, I learned that part of us being safe is changing these laws. And so that's where our education and advocacy came in. And I learned a whole lot more about it as a medicine and how to utilize that and that in food. And so then I started teaching classes because our medical program was in effect and we weren't getting that information in our community. We didn't even have access to doctors or dispensaries in our community, right? So I started doing workshops and then just teaching the class because I found in workshops it was difficult for people to come up and put their hands up because they didn't want to ask a silly or stupid question in front of people. In the kitchen, everybody asks all kinds of questions. They're comfortable, they're cooking. So it's really about creating comfortable places for people to learn. And we have so much left to learn. Even though it's legal, there's still so much left to learn, not just about the industry, but how to make it part of our society.
Okay. I'm thinking about this thing. And Dr. Robinson, let's say one of the things I know that was revealed is that the number one country in terms of understanding, studying, and actually putting out new findings related to cannabis has been Israel. Has the United States, since let's say the legalization of medical in a number of different states. Has that allowed the medical community to catch up with our research on the plant?
Not by any means. No, I mean, medicinal cannabis is legal on a federal level in a number of other countries, like Israel, like Canada. It is not in the United States. And despite all of these state-by-state experiments, at the federal level, which is where the big impetus for research is, it is still federally illegal. Now, the federal government, has its own cannabis farm at the University of Mississippi. And before the Controlled Substances Act and other prohibitions were established, the federal government was sending tins of cannabis to selected numbers of patients across the country.
Wow.
Because they had been prescribed under compassionate use provisions in the law, and they were treating extensive glaucoma. There were patients, one of the first patients who proved the compassionate use of cannabis, got tins of marijuana cigarettes straight from the University of Mississippi. Now that
the government was pre-rolling people's weed, y'all. The government
exactly. And shipping it to them to their doorstep
using the U.S. Postal Service. All of that.
That's right.
So that's all federal crimes right there. That the government.
That's right. They created the loophole, so they just drove that Mack truck through it. And that's the thing that we can never forget, that these laws, these are artificial creations. These laws are man-made. They're not handed down on any stone tablets. And these laws can be revised and changed, as we see every day with what's happening at the Supreme Court. And it takes, collective, legislative and political action to create these laws, and these provisions and this access is created as we speak in New York State. And so it really is incumbent upon all of the activists to remain active and to encourage other members in the community to get active and use those levers of power, because clearly on all of these legislators at the federal and the state level have been captured by all these corporations who have only one bottom line, and that is shareholder returns. And,
Dr. Robinson is making a very good point. We you talked about inclusivity earlier, and we have this catch-22 in this country, right? Where we want to do the right thing, but if we don't put it in writing, it's not going to get done.
Correct.
Right. So on a federal level, those restrictions are kind of hog-tying small business people. They don't have access to loans. They don't have access to insurance. They don't have access to all these other securities that happen if on a federal level it was illegal, right? But our legislature also knows that if we don't put caveats in these bills, we're still not going to get access to it, right? So we have the MORE Act, which is kind of similar to the MRTA in New York, where it has criminal justice reforms. It has some inclusivity and equity, some, not a lot. A lot of those got cut, but some inclusivity and equity concerns. And then we have the Safe Banking Act. And we have a lot of people in the industry like, we got to get safe banking passed, because if we don't get that passed, small businesses don't have access to loans and it's more difficult and you can't do this and you can't do that. But the MORE Act is saying, but they still might not be guaranteed that access if we don't get these provisions written down. So we're in this catch-22, right? And we are using, yes, as somebody who's in the industry, I agree. Without safe banking, I'm hogtied. I'm hogtied to do a lot of things. But without the MORE Act, I know that even though I might not be hogtied, I still might not be allowed into the pen. you know?
But and there's because medicinal cannabis is falls under state jurisdiction, as does the practice of medicine, and I think all of these state legislatures need to be pushed to respond more creatively to the needs of the cannabis community in their respective states. And New York State in and of itself has only made part progress in terms of that. So, for example, they got off, I think, on the wrong foot in terms of organizing the medical side of the industry in New York State, because they stipulated that it had to be vertically organized, which precluded the involvement of people who did not come with millions of dollars to set up the whole supply chain from seed to sale. And the expedient, of course, was that it could get the industry up and running faster, and because all of these corporations come in with big bucks and set up their whole line from stem to stern. But it also prohibited a lot of community input into that industry. And fortunately, the adult use legislation allows for more horizontal organization of the industry, so that community members can participate in any number of those horizontally organized niches in the adult use side. Now, I think that New York should revisit the organization of the medical side to similarly allow social equity applicants into a horizontally organized or horizontally modified medical industry as well. There are other things that the state can do in terms of funding its own research base. There are other states, notably California, that uses tax revenue specifically to investigate and establish
That's in the cannabis law here in New York. So part of that taxation is supposed to go to research, and it's also supposed to go to education, and it's also supposed to go to, and unfortunately, some of those research dollars. Yes, some of those research dollars are supposed to go to research that specifically addresses enforcing what a major concern was driving while impaired.
Right.
So how do we monitor impairment? But there are monies going into medical research. But again, this also speaks to what you were saying, Dr. Robinson. It's the stigma. It's the stigma that addresses our legislature. It's, as an activist, as an advocate, I have had to educate every legislative body that I've spoken to. I've had to educate our faith-based community. That's a double tier of yes, it does hurt. But that's a double tier of work. That's an extra layer of work that we have to do. So we're not just pushing for something, we're breaking stigma down and re-educating, and then working toward some kind of law or regulation.
Well,
around
the stigma was put in place over 70 or 80 years of this public relations campaign against the drug, of stigmatizing it. It was putting in place and to justify all of the community disruption that happened after that. And I hopefully it doesn't take 70 years to become dismantled, but it was in the 1800s in this country, the foremost manufacturers of pharmaceutical drugs all had preparations on the shelves in drugstores of tincture of cannabis extract as a medicine that was sold in drugstores.
Wow.
The cannabis was in the U.S. pharmacopoeia from the 1850s all the way up to 1940. And so there was an active campaign against it for all of these negative purposes. And, that needs to be pointed out. And that can begin, to be one of the fundamental things to unravel this stigma, because people were sold a bill of goods about the cannabis and all of the evils of evil weed, reefer madness and all of that stuff. It's just horrendous.
But as a community, we don't do a good job of making sure that we utilize the plant responsibly either. So part of that stigma fed us into a place where we don't use the plant. We misuse it. We don't use it in a way that's optimal for us. I am a wholehearted believer that, part of the medicine of the plant is it addressing a lot of the stress, a lot of the racial stress that we encounter every day as a people. But, there is a lot of overuse and misuse, and that comes from the lack of education about the plant. That comes from the minimalizing the importance of the plant. Like you're talking about it being on the shelves and part of our pharmacopoeia, but it was also part of our society. And if you go farther back, it was part of our society. It has the power it has now as a quote unquote drug because of that prohibition, because of that stigma. So a lot of our young people use it in a way to be rebellious. And the plant doesn't have the respect it merits.
Put some respect on the plant's name.
That's right. Put some respect on it. Put some respect on it.
Now there are other states, for example, like Florida, which has specifically funded the Florida A&M University to set up educational forums where they have roundtables with physicians, with pharmacists, with a police officer, and a pastor, a preacher, or some other holy man, to go to different communities throughout the state to talk about medicinal cannabis specifically. And they've gone up and down the state. They have these forums on a regular basis. They're online, but they've done a lot of outreach to educate the communities statewide about medicinal benefit. And in these community forums, they have the option to talk to the doctor, the pharmacist, the police officer, and the pastor. And many of those pastors who appear in these programs are they have talked about the plant as a healing herb. It comes from nature. And I think, they can cite scripture in terms of how the use of the herbs and plants was given to mankind. And I think that can be one aspect to sort of unravel the stigma coming from men of the cloth.
Wow. So here's the question then. So you're saying these are, and I'm assuming Dr. Robinson, these are black pastors.
Yes.
Speaking to the black. Okay. Understood. So do me a favor, Saki, in terms of, let's say, opportunities in the space, all right? I don't want to be a dispensary. I don't want to be a grower. Right? Give me, let's say, a short list of a number of the opportunities that might be available to me in the space.
So one of the things I mentioned earlier were contractors. All of our cultivation spaces, all of our consumption spaces, because we have consumption in our legislation here, all of our cultivation dispensary, that's retail and consumption, they're going to have regulated specs into how they're going to need to be built. You're going to need to have vaults in your dispensaries and your cultivation. You're going to need to have a certain way that you're allowed to move your clientele through the space. You're going to need to have HVAC and ventilation in all three of them. You're going to need to have disposal. So security, security is going to be huge at all of these places. But these are all things we already do. We just need to start thinking about how can we do them in cannabis. And part of how we do that is looking at regulations in other states, looking at the cannabis law and seeing what some of the things that are going to be allowable, right? We right now have a lot of gray market dispensaries open, right? Where they're like, weed, we selling weed, wide open, neon signs, you know, people
They got
outside.
trucks in front of the Cat's Deli and
in cannabis outfits, spinning signs. None of that's going to be allowable, right? In the regulated space. So those things are already in the law. And if you are a contractor, a sign maker, if you're any of those people, look at the law and see how you can fit in, right? Look to California. Look to Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a very close neighbor. And a lot of the regulations that they have are going to be duplicated in New York. Same with security. Look to what some of those security parameters are. Insurance agents, we need you. We desperately need you because of the federal prohibition. We need people who can see what kind of policies we can get to protect our businesses. Do you do packaging? You're gonna need that. Do you do branding? Do you do marketing?
Nice.
Do you have transportation is another thing. Are you a transportation specialist? Have you been driving children around for ages? Do you work in alcohol and food? Then you understand compliance.
Wow.
Like, what do we do in our community? How about this? How many of our people own property?
Yes,
Outright,
indeed.
that we've had from our parents. How many of us own property?
Right.
Because we're not going to be allowed to include banks. Do you own property that is in an area that's regulated and allowable and will create space for people to rent from you?
Incredible. And tell me about your experience in terms of, let's say, the whole banking part. How do you manage to, let's say, navigate in that space, knowing that a federally licensed bank can't do it? So what have you been able to do?
There are credit unions. I'm not going to say what I've been able to do on this open air platform, but there are credit unions who are a little more flexible if you have a cannabis business. There are banks, larger banks like East West Bank created a cannabis program. Wow. There are banks that are creating cannabis programs and trying to work around those provisions, but it will cost you. And it will cost you because it costs them. It costs them because this is a Schedule I substance. If a bank suspects that the money is coming from something like heroin or slavery or prostitution, they're supposed to report every cent that comes into the bank, right? That costs money for them, right? You'll find that that insurance will charge more money. There are people who will charge more money because of these federal things. So you have to realize that it's going to cost you more money.
Because of their risk.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, gotcha. And okay, so with my lens, I'm just looking at the landscape there. To you, Dr. Robinson, what does equity look like? What do you see? Let's say a fair system, because we know that New York is going to be coming online soon. What will it look like? Then you say, you know what, they got it right, or they did not get it right.
I think that's going to be a work in progress, and equity, is a way to upfront invest resources in the restoration to all of these communities that have been impacted adversely by the war on drugs, which means providing resources upfront to allow those members of the community to get involved in this community as a vehicle to, in a way, restore and repair some of the impact done. And that means providing upfront resources, as the state is doing in some aspects, in terms of the collaboration with the dormitory authority to help locate sites for dispensaries to avoid the mistake that other states have made, requiring applicants for licenses to already have real estate leases in hand. And then when the process gets prolonged and delayed because of litigation, these people are dying on the vine financially because they still have to pay to maintain a lease that they can't use because the license is still hung up in the legislation somewhere, or the litigation. So it provides greater access instead of the capital requirements. Again, those things I find often work at cross purposes. I don't know. This is a direct challenge. To put in social equity provisions in a nakedly capitalistic system. But that is the challenge, and the way to, I think, re-equilibrate that equation is for greater and greater community participation in the legislative process, which can help fend off the predations of naked capital.
Okay.
Do you mind if I throw in?
Go right in there, because I'm going to say, I was going to say your equity lens. Go ahead.
So, I hate to sound like a broken record, but equity is difficult without education. And the reason I say this is because we regulate the plant and we operate the plant as an industry like it's a sin, like it's a vice, right? And because we do that, we know that there's more risk, so we charge more money. We know that there's, we spend so much time trying to protect people from the plant, we overtax on it. So one of the reasons why a lot of smaller businesses, a lot of Black and Latin, basically African descended and Indio descended businesses fail is because of all of these precautions that are put onto the industry because it's considered a sin. So because it's a sin, it's tough to create equity. It's tough to create equal spaces. See, my mother doesn't even know what equity is. But it's tough to create equal spaces when we have all of these other barriers to get through. So we have the racial barrier, we have the access to income, and now we have the barrier of all these regulations because it's sin. It's sinful advice. So, and we also have to look at the plant holistically. I mentioned earlier, we do all of these things like, we got to own dispensaries because that's where the money is. We got to touch the plant. We got to be as close to the plant as possible. We have to make the plant part of our society, part of our collective community, right? And if we think about the plant as giving back to the community, community can give to the plant, and we can create equity in that as well. All of us in all of our industries, how is the plant part of us?
And Saki, this is unique to our community, because I don't think the founders of, let's say, MedMen or one of those other big operators goes to sleep, or has trouble sleeping and about putting back into the community at all.
I mean, that's the racist foundations of our country. We have to care about a lot more stuff that other people do not care about. Shoot, we got to care about going to grocery stores and schools and not being shot at. You know what I'm saying? Wow. Like we gotta be concerned about driving while Black, driving while Latin. You know what I'm saying? Raising children while Indian. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that we got to worry about that they don't worry about. Like on a for real level, there's a lot of stuff they don't worry about that we worry about.
Saki, I want to ask you for what is your path for TLBK at this point? Because you wear different hats as an activist, an educator, and an entrepreneur. So where do you see your own fit into this ecosystem?
It's difficult. So New York is the #1 consumers in the world. So we're basically a consumer market, right? And I am pursuing a license based on us being a consumer market. But I also am very dedicated into creating a model or a brand that emphasizes the inclusion of our society into cannabis. So I don't want to create a brand that completely caters to cannabis consumers, but that caters to the education and inclusion of cannabis into our society. It's a little vague. I know it's a little vague.
Well, I understand because there's so many moving pieces, and to actually, make a decision on where you actually fit in, because there's two columns. There is the need the plant touching, which means you need to be licensed, and then there's all these ancillary markets, the pickaxes and shovels and the gold rush, but that don't need to be licensed. And so anybody who approaches the market has to start at looking at well, do I need to go for a regulated position and a license, or is there do I have a set of skills that can dovetail in, and I can still benefit from the industry, support the industry, profit the industry, but not necessarily have to go through the licensing process. And I think that makes a big decision on how quickly you can move, because how you want to move and what sector you're in, we are all beholden to the schedule of actually going through the issuing of the regulations and the reviewing and the final passing of the regulations. So depending on what someone wants to do, if you want to do consumption lounges, you're going to be the last in line. The hemp growing and the actual growing the plant has started. We're still, I guess, looking for more regulations on extractions and some of the other niches that people will be allowed to participate in.
And, if you are in the medical industry, like Dr. Robinson, if you're an educator, if you are a researcher, we need all of you people too. There's a whole lot to do right now.
And Dr. Robinson, we've had this conversation about how they have not really clarified how you can be an entrepreneur in the medical cannabis space yet. And that's still something that we have to continue to engage and advocate for.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that I'd like to say. I mean, the organization that of which I am president, Society of Cannabis Clinicians, has been working for more than 2 decades to try to fill the gap in terms of the clinical education of medical providers, pharmacists, nurses, doctors, PAs, about the medicinal benefits of cannabis. And we have a website with extensive educational resources aimed at clinical providers, but also available to other individuals as well, looking at the cutting edge research in terms of how cannabis has been applied to a number of clinical issues, from cancer, chronic pain, autism, dementia, a lot of common ailments. And we are advocating for, increasing the research into the benefits of clinical cannabis, because, the plant itself, even in the last century, has taught us, and it was through investigations into the plant, particularly THC, that led us to the discovery of a fundamental physiologic system that we had never recognized before, the endocannabinoid system.
Mm-hmm.
And it's present not only in humans and other primates, but it is present in the evolutionary scale in the animal kingdom going back 600 million years. And this is something that has been, a font for further research that's taking place and should take place in not only in other countries but in this country itself. But in terms of the medical aspects, there are tremendous, opportunities for education, opportunities for the development of new medications, new applications. There are more ways to use medicinal cannabis than just inhaling it or vaporizing it. There are topicals, there are edibles, there are suppositories, there are all kinds of different ways to apply it. And we know that, you can derive medicinal benefits without getting high. So there's a lot that the plant has to teach us. And just to go back to the historic involvement of the plant in human society, looking at that history is one way, I think, from my standpoint, to dismantle that stigma.
And remember, like Dr. Robinson said earlier, California was the first state to basically legalize cannabis. And most of the kind of commercial aspects that we have around the plant now, in terms of the way it's ingested or applied, or a lot of its uses, come from that medical market that California had for basically up to 30 years, I believe. It was 1996 until 2015. Is that when Prop 215 was turned over and Prop 64 came? And
right.
Prop 64 is what's the adult use market now.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And so let's remember that as a medical market, it created spaces for people to have co-ops. It created spaces for people to develop clones, for people to develop new strains, for people to develop new ways to ingest, topicals, edibles, all of these things that we have now, gummies, just all. Think about it. Think about our inhalers, not inhalers. What are those things called? Help me out.
Vaporizers.
Vaporizers. All of that came out of the California medical market, right? They've been doing their own research with support on a state level and on a community level, on a patient community level for years. So don't think that just because that all of that comes because we commercialized the plant. That came from us as a community, mobilizing around the plant. We created entrepreneurial, what is the saying? You can do good while you can do well while doing good. You can still make money doing good things for people.
And I'd like to reinforce that. Yes, there was a tremendous amount of innovation that came out of the medical market, but let's not forget, the medical market was pushed by patients, by veterans, by HIV/AIDS sufferers, by community advocates who didn't need doctors to tell them that it worked, didn't need the law to say that it was legal. In fact, they in the face of law enforcement, they proceeded to do this and to use this because they knew that it worked. They knew it worked. So it was driven by patients and not by capital. And one of the things I think, looking back on it, that stimulated this tremendous innovation was that in California, the medical market was horizontally organized. So you could have growers over here that grew. You could have clone manufacturers over there. You could have, edible manufacturers, people who made, vaporizers. With that, so they could focus on their niche without having this huge, lumbering behemoth of having this one corporation control seed to sale. when their focus is on the bottom line and not on innovation. And I think, we need to have that. One of the things I'm very glad that got into this current New York law was to allow home grow. And I think that's a very important aspect and an opportunity, not only for community participation, community gardens, community education around growing and cultivating a personal relationship with the plant and a personal relationship with your medicine. And I think that's a very important provision. That's I'm glad to see made it into the New York law.
Absolutely.
Yeah, me
Absolutely.
too. So we actually have to wrap up now. This has been a great stimulating conversation, and I really love the synergy of the comments. I think Saki Led was saying that we need to think about the plant as medicine first.
Yes.
And I think
Yes.
Dr. Robinson has been always saying that. And I think that as we keep that in mind, it gives us a better focus on the opportunities involved in the plant than some of the other approaches. And we've seen with MedMen faltering and then getting acquired that just because you have the capital doesn't mean you have any clue what the hell you're doing. See how I did that, Saki? I avoided the bad word there too. Quasi. Well, you could say, you could say hell. You can say, there's a couple of words we can still get by without having problems with our FCC overlords.
But now, is WTF allowed?
If you use the initials, that's fine. Yeah,
Okay.
that could be a lot of things. It could be Waste Transfer Foundation. I don't know.
Apply to organizations like MedMen.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I want to thank you both for participating. I want to make sure that I put up on the screen. This is the contact information for Saki Fenderson. You can find out more about her at this website or follow her on IG or Twitter. And of course, Dr. Robinson, you can find out more about Cannabis Clinicians at cannabisclinicians.org or email him at this address. So both of you guys, you have an open invitation. We are going to continue to participate in and engage with the development of this industry. And I thank you both for the role you've played in helping us to get where we are so far, understanding we still have a long way to go, but we want to acknowledge the people who have really put in the time and effort that we could shape a fair and equitable industry here in New York. So this has been Soul Lounge Primetime on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. And you can also find us streaming live on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you all soon.